3 weeks from now, a government somewhere will borrow another few billion dollars. Not because things are going well, because they aren't. The strange part, everyone involved knows the country is already buried in debt. Investors know it. Economists know it. The politicians signing the papers definitely know it. And yet, the borrowing continues. Again and again and again. If this were a household, the bank would shut the door immediately. If it were a company, bankruptcy courts would already be involved. But governments operate under a completely different set of rules. In fact, some of the richest and most powerful countries in the world are also the most heavily indebted in history. The United States owes more than $34 trillion. Japan's government debt is more than twice the size of its entire economy. Many developing countries are borrowing money just to pay interest on money they already borrowed. So the obvious question becomes impossible to ignore. Why do governments keep borrowing, even when they're already broke? And more importantly, why do lenders keep giving them money? To understand that, we have to step into a system that looks logical on the surface, but becomes deeply strange the closer you look. Because government debt isn't really about money, it's about time, power, and a very fragile kind of trust. Imagine a country's finances like a giant household budget. Money comes in through taxes, income tax, sales tax, corporate tax, property tax. That's the government's salary. Then there are expenses, schools, roads, hospitals, police, defense, pensions, social programs. And if those expenses are higher than tax income, a gap appears. Economists call this a deficit. Most households solve this problem one of two ways: earn more money or spend less. Governments have a third option: borrow the difference. And borrowing sounds harmless at first. A country issues something called a government bond. A bond is basically an IOU. You give the government money today, they promise to pay you back later, with interest. The lender might be a pension fund, a bank, a foreign government, or even ordinary people buying bonds through investment funds. In return for lending money, they receive steady interest payments, safe, predictable, reliable. At least, that's the theory. And for a long time, government debt actually worked very well. After World War II, many countries borrowed enormous amounts of money to rebuild their economies. But those economies were growing quickly. Factories expanded, populations increased, technology improved productivity. So even though governments owed money, the economy was growing faster than the debt, which meant paying it back wasn't a huge problem. Growth quietly erased the burden. This created an important belief that still shapes global finance today. As long as the economy grows, debt is manageable, but that assumption started to crack over time. Because growth slowed, populations aged, costs exploded, and governments kept spending, here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Most government spending today isn't about new projects, it's about promises made decades ago: pensions, healthcare, social benefits, programs designed for a younger population, supporting a smaller group of retirees. But demographics flipped. In many countries, fewer workers are supporting more retirees, which means tax revenue grows slowly, while obligations grow rapidly. Imagine a family where fewer people are working, but more relatives move into the house expecting financial support. That math gets ugly fast. Governments face the same pressure, except cutting benefits is politically dangerous. Raising taxes is unpopular. So once again, borrowing becomes the easiest option. Not the best option, just the easiest. At this point, you might wonder why lenders tolerate this. Why would anyone lend money to a country that's already drowning in debt? The answer lies in something almost invisible: perception. Government bonds are treated as one of the safest assets in the financial world. Banks hold them. Insurance companies rely on them. Pension funds depend on them. Central banks store them as reserves. The entire financial system uses government debt as a foundation. It's the closest thing global finance has to a risk-free asset. But here's the quiet irony. The reason government bonds appear safe is because everyone believes they are safe. And everyone believes they are safe because governments have never been allowed to fail on a large scale in the modern system. Whenever the system gets close to that point, central banks step in. Central banks are the institutions that control a country's currency. And during financial crises, they have a special tool. They can create money, not by printing trucks of cash, but digitally. During the 2008 financial crisis, central banks bought trillions of dollars worth of government bonds. This policy became known as quantitative easing. The idea was simple. If investors stop buying government debt, the central bank becomes the buyer, which pushes interest rates down. and keeps the borrowing machine running. This stabilized markets. But it also changed something fundamental. For the first time in modern history, governments realized there might always be a buyer for their debt, even if private investors lost interest, even if deficits exploded, even if the numbers stopped making sense, because the central bank could step in. That realization quietly rewrote the rules of borrowing. Now the incentives are very different. Politicians operate on short election cycles, 4 years, sometimes less. Voters care about jobs, healthcare, and public services right now, not about debt projections 30 years from now. Borrowing allows governments to deliver benefits today while pushing the bill into the future. It's politically perfect. Spend now, pay later, and hope economic growth eventually solves the problem. But here's the catch. Interest. When governments borrow money, they must pay interest on that debt. If the debt becomes large enough, interest payments alone start consuming huge portions of the national budget. In some countries, interest payments are already one of the largest government expenses, not schools, not infrastructure, not healthcare, just the cost of past borrowing. And if interest rates rise, those costs explode. Suddenly, governments are borrowing money just to pay interest on previous loans, which means new debt isn't funding new projects, it's simply keeping the old debt alive. At that point, the system starts to resemble something uncomfortably familiar, a debt spiral. But here's the strange part. A country can operate inside that spiral for a surprisingly long time. Japan is a famous example. Its government debt is more than 250% of its economy. That would bankrupt almost any company on earth. Yet Japan continues functioning normally. Why? Because most of the debt is owned domestically, and the central bank buys enormous amounts of it, so the system keeps circulating internally. It looks unstable, but it continues operating, which creates a dangerous illusion. If Japan can do it, maybe everyone can. Except that assumption ignores a crucial difference. Not all countries control their own currency. When a government borrows in a currency it cannot print, things get dangerous quickly. Many developing countries borrow in US dollars because international investors trust the dollar more than local currencies. But that creates a trap. If their own currency weakens, their debt becomes more expensive to repay. Suddenly, the government owes far more than expected. This has triggered dozens of financial crises throughout modern history. Argentina, Greece, Sri Lanka, countries forced into painful austerity programs, massive inflation, or outright default, which reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. Government debt only feels safe until it suddenly doesn't. And this is where the global system becomes quietly absurd. Many governments are now borrowing enormous sums, not because they want to, but because the system almost requires it. Pension funds need government bonds. Banks use them as collateral. Financial markets price assets based on them. If governments suddenly stopped issuing debt, the financial plumbing itself would start malfunctioning. In other words, the world economy has become dependent on government borrowing, which means the incentives push in one direction, more debt, not less. Now zoom out even further. Global government debt recently passed $90 trillion. That number is so large it becomes abstract, but its implications are very real because debt represents claims on future income, future taxes, future productivity, future generations, and those generations will inherit a world where massive portions of national budgets are already committed to paying for decisions made decades earlier. That doesn't automatically mean collapse. History shows countries can carry heavy debt for long periods, but it does change the margin for error. Economic shocks become more dangerous. Interest rate changes become more painful. Political choices become more constrained. Debt narrows the future. So we return to the original question. Why do governments keep borrowing even when they're already broke? Because stopping is politically painful. Because lenders believe governments won't fail. Because central banks can stabilize crises. Because the financial system relies on government bonds. And because growth might eventually solve the problem. Might. But underneath all of that, there's a quieter reason: time. Debt allows governments to move financial pressure forward to the next election, the next administration, the next decade, sometimes the next generation. And for a long time, that strategy worked. The future kept arriving with enough growth to absorb the past. But the real question isn't why governments borrow today. The real question is, what happens when the future finally arrives and the math stops cooperating?